From cold superstars who acted like the rest of the field barely existed, to fan favorites whose confidence sometimes crossed into full-blown ego, these are the 8 most arrogant players in golf history. And while all of them built that reputation in different ways, by the time we get to number 1, you'll see why that spot was almost impossible to argue with. So first, let's start with number 8. Number 8, Vijay Singh. Vijay Singh was never the loudest golfer in the room. He didn't build his image on flashy quotes or big emotional outbursts. In fact, that's exactly what makes him different from most of the names on this list. Because Vijay's version of arrogance felt colder than that, he often carried himself like he didn't owe anyone warmth, explanation, or approval, and to be fair, some of that came from who he was as a competitor. He was intense, obsessive, and famously serious about his work. But over time, that seriousness also created a reputation that he could be distant, dismissive, and completely uninterested in how other people felt about him. A good example came in 2020, when Singh entered a Korn Ferry Tour event, even though he was already a Hall of Fame level player with tens of millions in career earnings. Technically, he had every right to do it, but a lot of people saw it as tone deaf, especially because those spots matter a lot more to younger players trying to survive and move up. Korn Ferry player Brady Schnell even called the move selfish before later apologizing, and the backlash got big enough that Singh eventually withdrew. And that moment really sums up Vijay's image. It wasn't that he was walking around bragging. It was that he often gave off the feeling that if everyone else had a problem with what he was doing, that was their problem, not his. And compared to the next player, Vijay almost looks restrained. Number 7, Ian Poulter. Ian Poulter is one of those golfers where the line between confidence and arrogance disappeared a long time ago. Because yes, he was confident, extremely confident, but he also made sure you knew it. The outfits, the attitude, the stare-down energy, the way he carried himself in team events like he was built in a Ryder Cup lab just to torment opponents, all of it fed this image of a guy who didn't just believe in himself. He performed that belief, loudly. That's part of why Poulter became such a divisive figure. His fans saw swagger. His critics saw a guy who loved the sound of his own legend a little too much. One of the clearest examples came during the 2013 Open at Muirfield, when Poulter complained publicly about the course setup and took heat for it, with criticism that his reaction came off as childish. Years later, even in his post-live comments, you could still hear that same proud, defiant tone when he talked about self-respect and not allowing people to disrespect him. And that's what makes Poulter such a good fit for this list. His arrogance, or perceived arrogance, was tied less to one scandal and more to the way he projected himself so forcefully. Sometimes he backed it up, especially in the Ryder Cup. But that doesn't make it any less arrogant. Number 6, Greg Norman. Greg Norman has long carried himself with the confidence of someone who knows exactly how big a figure he is in golf. And when you look at his career, that confidence makes sense. He was a former world number 1, a 2-time Open champion, and one of the most recognizable stars the sport has ever produced. Over time, Norman became more than just a golfer. He became a brand and one of the most influential public figures in the game. The problem is, when someone has that kind of stature, confidence can start turning into something else. A perfect example came in 2025, when he said he'd love to sit down with Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods and debate LIV Golf's impact on the sport, then casually added, "I'd win the debate." That line is incredible because it tells you everything. It's not just confidence. It's the assumption that if the biggest stars in the modern game sat across from him, he'd still be the smartest and most persuasive person at the table. That has always been the Norman aura: grand, forceful, certain. Even when the rest of the sport was moving in a different direction, he still sounded like a man who believed history would eventually prove him right. And that kind of self-belief can be magnetic, but it can also be annoying. Number 5. Bryson DeChambeau. Bryson DeChambeau never came off arrogant in the old-school country club villain sense. His arrogance had a different flavor. It was intellectual. Bryson built an identity around being the guy who saw golf differently, the scientist, the experimenter, the one measuring everything, tweaking everything, rethinking everything. And at first, that made him fascinating. But over time, it also made him look like someone who believed he had cracked the code while everyone else was still following outdated rules. That's when the backlash really started. Because even when Bryson was doing smart things, there was often this feeling that he didn't just trust his own methods. He thought the rest of the golf world was too limited to understand them. Then came the Brooks-Koepka feud, and suddenly the whole thing turned into chaos. Fans were chanting Brooksy at him. The rivalry had become a circus, and Bryson said the situation might be something the PGA Tour needed to handle if it escalated further. That's what made Bryson such an easy target at the time. He wasn't just intense. He gave off the vibe of a guy who thought his logic, his process, and his perspective were operating on a higher level than everybody else's. To some people, that was genius. To others, it was exhausting. And what makes Bryson interesting is that his public image has softened a lot since then. But during that stretch, he absolutely felt like one of the most arrogant figures in golf. Number 4. Phil Mickelson. Phil Mickelson might be the most interesting name on this entire list. Because to the public, Phil was the fun one, the thumbs-up guy, the entertainer, the gambler. The player who smiled at fans, pulled off absurd recovery shots, and always seemed like he was in on the joke. But inside golf, the picture was often much less flattering. For years, there was this lingering sense that Phil's charm could feel overly polished, overly calculated, even fake. GQ once quoted a tour source saying, "Phil Mickelson literally has no friends out there. He annoys everybody," and his old nickname Fig Jam, shorthand for a guy completely in love with himself, stuck to him for a reason. And the funny thing is, Phil sometimes leaned right into it. In 2021, after winning the PGA Championship at Kiowa in one of the most improbable major victories ever, a fan asked him for advice about playing the course. Phil's answer? It's not that hard. Golf Digest basically called it Fig Jam at its finest. That is such a perfect Phil moment. Charming on the surface, slightly hilarious, but also dripping with self-satisfaction. That's why he ranks this high. Phil's arrogance was not loud or angry. It was smoother than that, wrapped in charm and confidence, which made it land very differently from some of the other names here. Number 3, Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods never needed to tell the world he was above everyone else. He carried himself like it was already obvious. And that's why his arrogance hit differently from almost everyone else on this list. Tiger wasn't out there begging to be liked. He wasn't trying to look relatable. He didn't need to win the room. He often gave off the sense that he was operating in a completely different category from the rest of the field. And to be fair, for a long time, he actually was. That's what made his arrogance so intimidating. It didn't feel theatrical. It felt imperial. It came from his aura, the coldness, the detachment, the way he could make even other elite players feel like supporting actors in his career. And even in 2024, you could still hear that same old Tiger edge. When Colin Montgomery questioned whether Woods should keep going, Tiger responded that he'd play as long as I can play and I feel like I can still win the event, then added that as a past Open champion, he was exempt until age 60, unlike Montgomery. It was classic Tiger, sharp, hierarchical, almost regal in its dismissal. That's why Tiger belongs here. Not because he was loud, because he didn't have to be. But for all of Tiger's intimidating superiority, the next golfer made arrogance look messier, uglier, and much harder to excuse. Number 2, Sergio Garcia. Sergio Garcia is one of the easiest names to justify on this list because his arrogance didn't just show up in his attitude, it showed up in behavior. For years, Sergio had this reputation as one of the most emotionally volatile stars in golf. Brilliant talent, no doubt, but also the kind of player who too often acted like his frustration gave him permission to do whatever he wanted. In 2007, Garcia got in trouble after spitting into a hole during a tournament round. His explanation afterward was basically that it was no big deal. Reuters reported that the incident was likely to lead to a fine, and that his response sounded weirdly casual about something most people thought was obviously out of line. Then came an even worse moment in 2019 at the Saudi International, where Garcia was disqualified after intentionally damaging multiple greens in frustration. Afterward, he apologized and said he had let his emotions get the better of him. And that's really Sergio in a nutshell. His arrogance wasn't always verbal. A lot of the time, it came through in the assumption that if he was angry enough, normal standards no longer applied to him. That entitlement is why he lands all the way at number 2. But if Sergio was arrogant in bursts, number 1 turned arrogance into a full-time public identity. Number 1, Patrick Reed. Some golfers get called arrogant once or twice. Patrick Reed built a reputation around it. That's what separates him from everyone else on this list. Because with Reed, the arrogance label is not subtle, and it's not just fan talk either. In Golf.com's anonymous European Tour Pro survey, the most common one-word description of Patrick Reed was arrogant. And honestly, once you look at his career, it's not hard to see why. The quote that still defines the whole image came in 2014, when Reed declared, "I'm one of the top 5 players in the world." Only, at that moment, he was ranked 20th in the world, not 5th, which is exactly why the comment blew up the way it did. Now, confidence in sports is normal. Great athletes almost need it. But that comment hit differently because it sounded less like belief and more like a demand to be recognized on his own terms, no matter what anyone else thought. Then you add the controversies, the constant rules debates, the way he often seemed to lean into the villain role instead of backing away from it, and the picture gets even clearer. That's why Reed is number 1. Because with some golfers, arrogance is an interpretation. With Patrick Reed, it became a brand. And whether you see that as confidence, delusion, or just pure competitive ego taken too far, one thing is hard to deny. Nobody on this list wore it more naturally.